Today that my administration will focus on ending the absolutely horrific practice of human trafficking.
The California-wide raids, dubbed Operation Reclaim and Rebuild, happen every year. About 100 teams target alleged.
5:12 a.m., Sacramento. The neighborhood was submerged in an eerie silence. No traffic, no voices, only the faint glow of streetlights stretching across the walls of a sprawling $22.4 million estate. An official residence tied to one of the most powerful offices in the state. Within seconds, everything changed. No sirens, no flashing lights, no warning, only the low controlled rumble of a convoy, 9 unmarked black SUVs rolling into position with mechanical precision. More than 42 federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, moved in with exact coordination. The front gate was sealed. The rear access road was blocked. The entire 3-acre private property was locked down in under 90 seconds. This was not a routine inspection. This was a federally authorized takedown operation approved less than 4 hours earlier, backed by sealed search warrants tied to a rapidly expanding investigation that had already uncovered more than $98.7 million in suspicious financial transfers, routed through 27 shell companies across 12 states. The target was Jonathan Reeves, the sitting governor of California, a man who had signed legislation, approved multi-billion-dollar budgets, and stood before cameras as a symbol of leadership. But behind that image, investigators now believed something else had been operating completely out of sight. 5:14 a.m. The signal was given. Without hesitation, the front door was breached in a controlled entry. Tactical units surged inside, clearing the ground floor, then advancing upward room by room with absolute discipline. In less than 5 minutes, the entire 11,800 FT residence was under federal control. Reeves was taken into custody inside his private office. No resistance, no statement, no final words, only silence. Minutes later, the charges were outlined. A multi-year criminal network involving more than $98 million in illicit financial activity tied to real estate laundering operations spanning 12 states and a smuggling corridor that had moved an estimated $310 million in assets over 9 months. But the house itself didn't make sense. Not to the agents. Architectural plans obtained weeks earlier showed nothing unusual. Yet inside the walls were thicker than standard structural design. Storage areas were misaligned. Load-bearing sections defied architectural logic. Acoustic sensors detected abnormal voids beneath the foundation. Something was hidden. The case was no longer just about financial crime. This was concealment. That was the moment everything changed. If this level of corruption sends a chill down your spine, make sure to like and subscribe, because what began as a silent raid this morning is unfolding into a federal investigation that could shake the entire system behind it. That if you engage in human trafficking activities, harm our children, and destroy lives, there will be absolute consequences, and there is no refuge for predators in the state of California. 5:26 a.m. The second sweep order was issued. Attention. Shifted from the main residence to the rear of the property, that garden would completely change the nature of the case. At first, the signs were difficult to detect. Subtle disturbances in the soil were too precise to be natural. Irrigation pressure fluctuated when it should have remained stable. In one corner beneath a decorative fence line, the ground had sunk nearly 3 in. Not enough to be clearly visible, but enough to raise suspicion. Thermal imaging equipment was deployed. Within seconds, it detected anomalies nearly 3.6 meters beneath the surface. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a concealed structure spanning more than 7,700 square FT, completely absent from any official records tied to the property. And then something worse emerged. More than 100 distinct heat signatures densely concentrated within a confined underground space. Too many, too close together. This was not coincidence. This was not part of any approved design. And a narrow steel ladder dropped into darkness, illuminated only by the beam of a mounted flashlight. Tactical units descended first, preparing for confined conditions, limited visibility, restricted airflow, and the possibility of resistance. But what they encountered was something entirely different. When the lights came on, the space below no longer resembled a bunker. This was not a shelter. This was an operational facility. The underground space had been transformed. More than 9,000 square ft of reinforced construction divided into sealed sections lined with soundproof walls supported by an independent ventilation system. Industrial air filtration units ran quietly overhead. Backup generators were active. This place was not abandoned, it was fully operational. At the center, a command system, a massive digital network stretched across the main wall, tracking more than 182 active transit corridors connected to 60 distribution points across multiple states. 3 walls were covered with digital displays. Large screens streamed live data, movement logs, identifiers, timestamps. Lines moved across the screens in real time, linking locations across multiple states: California, Nevada, Arizona, and beyond. Along a heavily secured wall, agents discovered storage compartments. Inside, bundles of cash, more than $9 million in vacuum-sealed, labeled, categorized currency. Tracing the financial flow revealed even more. Funds had been routed through more than 70 shell entities spanning multiple states and offshore jurisdictions. Individual transfers ranged from $45,000 to $2.3 million, deliberately structured to stay below federal reporting thresholds. Every transaction was designed to disappear, but the money was only a layer. Deep within the system, analysts uncovered an encrypted file, a network tied to human trafficking, lists of locations, seaports, warehouses, transit hubs, coordinates linked to routes near the U.S.-Mexico border. A total of 129 underage girls may have been processed through the system. This was no longer about identity fraud. This was direct evidence tied to human lives, an organized operation running simultaneously through financial systems, physical infrastructure, and international channels. By 6:02 a.m., Federal Command had been notified. The scope of the investigation was officially expanded. What began as a targeted arrest had now become a multi-agency case involving financial crime, cross-border operations, and organized trafficking networks. And for the agents on site, one thing was now undeniable. The man they had just arrested was not acting alone, and the house they had just searched, that was only the beginning. Stay with us. If this shocks you, drop the word exposed in the comments to keep this investigation going. By 6:46 a.m., the operation had crossed a line no one in the task force could have anticipated. At the moment, Federal Command began reviewing the first wave of data collected from beneath the garden. One thing became clear. This was no longer a hidden room or even a concealment operation. This was a system. Inside the underground facility, forensic teams worked in real time extracting and mapping encrypted files recovered from the servers. What began as fragmented data, coordinates, transaction logs, identifiers, was quickly organized into a structured network. It was a list of names, 21 individuals, each assigned a specific role: port inspectors, transportation coordinators, licensing officials, private contractors, personnel working within city offices and regulatory agencies. Some operated inside distribution centers. Others controlled permits, inspections, and clearance processes. A select few had direct access to compliance systems tied to federal oversight. Each name was tied to movement. Each role was linked to a route. As investigators mapped the data, the full structure began to emerge. A network of 27 active transit corridors stretching across at least 6 states: California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Oregon, and Washington. These routes were not temporary. They were synchronized, timed, maintained. Supporting these corridors were 14 controlled storage facilities strategically positioned near highways, ports, and secondary logistics hubs. Each site was coded, monitored, and supplied through a multi-layered approval chain, masking illegal operations beneath legitimate fronts: construction material shipments, medical supply transfers, equipment contracts. Investigators identified the operational pattern. This system was not funded solely through traditional criminal channels. It relied on a hybrid structure combining illicit trafficking with the exploitation of community-based programs. Records showed that fraudulent identities were used to access benefits tied to child care services, medical assistance, and social support systems. On paper, the transactions appeared routine. Each financial cycle moved between $3.2 million and $7.8 million, distributed through shell entities before being redirected back into the network. Individuals involved received payments ranging from $900,000 to over $2.4 million per cycle, depending on their level of access and control. And it did not stop at money. Running parallel to the financial system was a secondary transport layer. Data logs confirmed the movement of controlled substances, more than 620 kilos of narcotics transported through the same corridors feeding distribution points linked to street-level organizations. The system sustained itself. Money funded movement. Movement expanded reach. According to federal investigators, the financial architecture of the network was a masterpiece of criminal engineering. They were not spending money on luxury, not in the way most would expect. By 7:16 a.m., all ambiguity was gone. This was not a network that had infiltrated government systems. This was a network operating through them. Structures designed to enforce the law had been exploited, used to protect, guide, and expand a nationwide criminal enterprise. Everything had been leveraged to shield, direct, and scale an operation of national scope. If you believe federal agents can dismantle this network, comment. Shut it down. Your support matters. 1:12 p.m. By early afternoon, the investigation had crossed a critical threshold. The data recovered from beneath the garden was no longer being analyzed. It was being acted upon. Among hundreds of coordinates, one location stood out. A warehouse complex located less than 2 mi from a major transit corridor in Nevada, marked with the most recent activity timestamp. Movement logs showed repeated entries within the past 6 hours, not historical data, not archived routes active. And according to the system, it was not cargo being moved, it was people. Within minutes, federal command authorized immediate deployment. A rapid response force of 182 agents was assembled, including members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and tactical units. From the Department of Homeland Security. No delay, no negotiation. 2:51 p.m. The convoy moved into position. From the outside, the structure appeared ordinary, a standard industrial site surrounded by stacked shipping containers and idle trucks. No visible security, no movement, no indication of what was inside. But thermal scans told a different story. Dozens of heat signatures were detected, clustered, confined, and unmoving. 3:03 p.m. The order was given. Outer perimeter units secured the surrounding area in under 90 seconds. Air support confirmed. No outbound movement as breach teams advanced toward the rear entry point. The silence was broken. Gunfire. Armed individuals inside the facility opened fire within seconds of the breach. The response was immediate and controlled. Flashbangs were deployed. Commands echoed through narrow corridors. Within 2 minutes, resistance on the upper level collapsed. 9 suspects were subdued. 3 were injured. No one escaped, but the real objective was not above ground. It was below. 3:11 p.m. A concealed access point was located behind a reinforced partition wall. Thermal imaging revealed dense heat signatures beneath the surface, too many too close together. The wall was breached. What lay beyond confirmed the worst fears. A basement level extending beneath the structure divided into multiple sealed compartments. Soundproofed, reinforced, ventilation running at minimal capacity. This was not detention. This was containment. Agents found them in the first room. Children at first a few dozen, then more, then more. Still initial count 129 minors ages 5 to 11. Many unconscious, others barely responsive. Identification numbers were written directly on their arms. No names, no records, only numbers. Medical teams were deployed immediately. Oxygen levels inside the chambers measured at dangerously low levels below 16%, a threshold capable of causing severe cognitive impairment within hours. Preliminary toxicology tests confirmed exposure to fast-acting sedatives at concentrations high enough to suppress movement and resistance. Time was critical. Minutes, possibly fewer, separated survival from fatality. As rescue operations continued, a secondary discovery revealed the scale of the network's financial backing behind another sealed compartment. Agents uncovered more than 1,200 kilos of narcotics, including fentanyl and heroin packaged for rapid distribution. Nearby, vacuum-sealed blocks of cash were stacked in precise rows. Preliminary estimates placed the combined value of drugs and currency at over $180 million. 4:02 p.m. The final suspect attempted to escape through a secondary tunnel system, but was intercepted within 43 seconds. No statement was given. No resistance followed. By late afternoon, all 129 children had been rescued and transported to medical facilities for emergency care. Federal units secured the entire site. Evidence was cataloged. Assets were seized. The entire building fell into silence. But not the kind that hides something, the kind that follows exposure. For the agents on site, there was nothing to celebrate. Only a brief moment of pause, long enough to understand that this operation had come dangerously close to total failure. And how many lives had been saved, just in time. By the following morning, the operation was no longer unfolding in the shadows. It had been fully exposed to the public. What began at 5:12 a.m., with a surprise breach at the governor's estate, had escalated into one of the largest federal cases in recent history. Within hours, federal prosecutors filed formal charges. The allegations were no longer limited to financial misconduct. They were systemic. A total of 18 federal charges were filed against the sitting governor of California. The list was extensive. Large-scale money laundering exceeding $98 million, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances involving more than 1,200 kilos of narcotics, and human trafficking directly tied to the rescue of 129 minors. Additional charges included wire fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of federal oversight. Each charge carried severe penalties. Legal analysts estimated that if convicted on all counts, the total sentence could exceed 65 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. But the consequences did not stop with one individual. Parallel investigations were launched across multiple states. Within 48 hours, federal agents executed an additional 26 search warrants across California, Nevada, Arizona, and Texas. Financial tracking units moved swiftly, freezing more than $142 million in assets linked to the network. Over 90 bank accounts were shut down in less than a single day, and then the numbers kept rising. Back in California, the impact was immediate. More than 170 government contracts tied to programs overseen during the governor's administration were placed under emergency review. At least 63 licensed facilities, including child care providers and social service organizations, were subjected to federal audits. Every document signed, every approval granted, every transaction processed was now under intense scrutiny because the question was no longer who. It was how far. By late afternoon, forensic teams made a discovery that shifted the entire direction of the case. Transaction logs extracted from secondary servers showed continued activity even after the arrest had taken place. Funds were still moving, this time in smaller amounts: $25,000, $60,000, $110,000. Fragmented transfers executed through newly identified shell entities. Within just 6 hours, more than $14.6 million had been redistributed across 19 separate accounts. This was not panic. This was procedure. Encrypted communications recovered during the investigation referenced a contingency structure internally coded as Phase 2. A secondary layer of the network composed of mid-level coordinators embedded across logistics firms, financial institutions, and regulatory bodies. Individuals unknown to the public, no political profiles, but with access. Preliminary estimates indicated at least 37 additional operatives still active, each capable of handling between $2 million and $5 million per quarter, enough to sustain the system, enough to rebuild it. By 6:40 p.m., Federal Command issued a nationwide alert. Surveillance teams were redeployed. Cyber units began tracking financial flows in real time. Additional warrants were being prepared because the reality could no longer be ignored. This was not a network built around a single leader. It was a structure designed for continuity. Remove one layer, another would rise to replace it. By the end of the third day, the full scale of the operation began to emerge. More than 98 million had been seized. Over 1.2 tons of narcotics had been recovered. 129 lives had been saved from disappearance, and a system multi-layered, coordinated, deeply embedded had been exposed. But even as arrests continued and assets were frozen, one truth remained unchanged. Not every part of the system had been found. Some segments had gone silent, just waiting for the pressure to ease, waiting for attention to fade, waiting for the moment to rebuild under a different name, a different structure, a different face. Because what this operation exposed was not just a criminal case. It was a vulnerability. Proof of how a coordinated network could penetrate deep into systems designed to protect the public, and how easily those systems could be exploited. And the question that remains is not what has been uncovered. It is what still remains hidden and whether the next operation is already underway. 9:12 p.m. Day 3, Sacramento. By the time darkness settled over the city, the operation had already moved far beyond the walls of a single mansion. What began as a controlled federal raid had now transformed into a coordinated national pursuit. There were no press briefings, no public alerts, just movement, quiet, synchronized, and escalating. At exactly 9:12 p.m., Federal Command authorized a full-scale expansion. Within minutes, more than 320 federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and multi-agency financial task forces were deployed across 11 states. Surveillance grids were activated. Cyber units began tracking live transaction flows. Aviation support units monitored outbound routes. Every known entry point into the system was being watched because by now one thing had become undeniable. The arrest of Governor Jonathan Reeves had not shut the system down. It had activated something else. Investigators referred to it as Phase 2. And Phase 2 was not political. It was not public. It was invisible. Within hours of the initial arrest, financial analysts flagged a new pattern. Smaller transactions, faster movements, distributed across newly identified entities. In just 12 hours, more than $28.3 million had been rerouted through 41 newly opened accounts tied to 23 shell companies that had never appeared in the original investigation. This was not panic. This was continuity. Each transaction was precise, ranging from $25,000 to $950,000, deliberately structured below federal reporting thresholds. The same pattern, the same discipline, the same design, but different operators. By midnight, a new list began to take shape. Not politicians, not high-profile figures, instead mid-level coordinators embedded across critical infrastructure, logistics, supervisors inside regional transport firms, compliance officers within financial institutions, licensing administrators connected to state-level regulatory offices. A total of 47 individuals were identified within the first wave of analysis. People no one would recognize, people who didn't need to be because they didn't run the system. They maintained it. At 1:36 a.m., Federal Command issued synchronized warrants across 4 key states: Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and Oregon. 17 locations were targeted simultaneously, no delays, no negotiation. By 2:05 a.m., entry teams were in motion. Warehouses, office buildings, private residences, small logistics hubs positioned near highway corridors and secondary ports. From the outside, each location appeared ordinary, operational, legal. But inside, the pattern repeated. Encrypted devices, financial ledgers, routing schedules, identity records, and in several locations, rooms designed not for storage, but for coordination. Multiple screens, live tracking dashboards, real-time shipment logs. The system was still active. By 3:12 a.m., the first wave of arrests was complete. 26 suspects were taken into federal custody, but not all of them. 8 individuals had already disappeared. No forced entry, no signs of struggle.